Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to take a minute or so to let everybody in from the waiting room. There's an awful lot of yous today. In fact, there are so many, the interest was so popular today that we are not only streaming this by Zoom, we are also streaming the session on Facebook. So hello to everybody in Zoom land, and a big hello to everybody in Facebook land. And also a big hello to anybody from outside Northern Ireland. No doubt there's plenty of you from outside Northern Ireland. Feel free to go on chat and say hello and where you're from. I would be very surprised if we don't have friends from America and from England and from the rest of Ireland. So today's presentation is researching farming ancestors in PRONI. That's by a very good friend of ours, Dr. William Roulston, who's regularly spoken at PRONI events. He last spoke about a year ago, and we are delighted to welcome William back again. William, for those of you who many of you will appreciate, is the research director of the Ulster Historical Foundation. That's a post he's been in for 15 years now. William is also author of Researching Family Ancestors and many, many, many other titles, which can be accessed by a UHF shop near you. I believe that shop is online. Just a few bits of administration before we kick off. Everybody is being muted, and that is to ensure that there's no background noise so we can all hear the speaker. We also would suggest you turn your videos off because we're going to be recording the session, and that will also helps the bandwidth as well because there's a lot of people here today. And I should just advise that William has a wee dose of a virus, so just bear with William today. I don't think it'll cause a problem, but if he coughs, just bear with him. So it's my pleasure now to ask William to come and join us and tell us about researching farming ancestors at PRONI. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for your kind words of welcome, and thanks to you for the invitation to speak on this occasion. Thanks to Lindsay, who's in the background, keeping things right also. And as Stephen was saying, the subject of my talk is really the looking at how you can trace your farming ancestors in PRONI. Now, of course, PRONI is an essential archive if you're looking for farming ancestors in Northern Ireland and indeed the province of Ulster. It's not the only place, but it is the major. It has the major collection of relevant records. So that's where I'm going to look at some of the more important sets of records and how they can help you in your research. Okay, let me begin just with a little bit of background. The Reverend Samuel Ferguson is maybe a strange person to start off with. Ferguson was a Reformed Presbyterian minister at Faughan near Drumahoe, just outside the city of Derry, in the early part of the 20th century. And in 1904, Ferguson proposed the setting up of an archive in which records relating to landed estates and landed families and farming families could be brought together and preserved for future generations. He was aware that this was a period of considerable change within, the nature of farming, the nature of landholding, the breakup of landed estates, and he believed that the danger was that so many records of importance would be lost. Now, as it happened, nobody took forward Ferguson's idea, but in the early 1920s, a new public record office for Northern Ireland was set up in Belfast. And it followed the very sad event of the destruction of the old Public Record Office of Ireland in Dublin in 1922, with the loss of such a vast quantity of records relating to the administration of Ireland. And so those who set up the new Public Record Office were very keen to find as many substitutes for the lost documents as possible. And they recognized that family papers and landed estate records, among others, were potentially of great importance in terms of understanding our past and the people who have lived in this place for generations. So right from the start, they began to acquire documents from estate offices, from solicitors' practices, and so on, and bring these into the new public record office and make them available. So interestingly, they used the newspapers to appeal for people to come forward with records, and also to highlight important donations of records that had been made to the new PRONI. And so you can see the Northern Whig of August 1925 listing different records that it had recently received, documents of a large collection of deeds for the Hamilton estate in County Down, for example, and other family papers. And the pioneering work of bringing in landed estate papers and other records relating to the occupation of land was continued by others in PRONI's history. This is Archives Week, and of course a major figure in archives in Ireland in the late 20th and early 21st centuries was Dr. Brian Traynor, who was head of PRONI for many, many years before becoming head of the Ulster Historical Foundation. And Dr. Traynor was very much involved in going out, identifying records and bringing them in to PRONI, and others, of course, were very much involved as well. Anthony Malcolmson, another former director of PRONI, made a mammoth contribution to the salvaging and preservation of records of landed estates. As a result of which, PRONI has an absolutely fabulous collection of documentation relating not only to the families themselves who own the estates, but to the occupiers of their estates, the farmers, the tenant farmers who for generations worked land before becoming able to become proprietors in their own right in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I'm going to look at, as I said, some records in PRONI that can help you find out more about your farming ancestors. I suppose the best way to interrogate what PRONI has is its e-catalogue. Those of you with memories now going back over 10 years will remember the old PRONI in Balmoral Avenue and the many paper catalogues around the walls detailing the records held by PRONI. Well, that information has now been captured digitally and can be accessed through the PRONI e-catalogue. And one of the great strengths of PRONI's collections is the degree to which they have been catalogued. In many instances, you can get right down to the individual documents through the e-catalogue. One thing to say about the e-catalogue, don't think that you just put your ancestor's name in, click search and hope for the best, and if they don't come back, well, that's it. You're never going to find them. Think of the e-catalogue as a way of interrogating PRONI's collection to find out what they do have and look for guidance as to the sorts of documents that you may wish to look at during a visit to PRONI. Now, again, just to emphasize how PRONI was really making an effort in its early days in the 1920s to acquire records relating to the occupation of land. I've just brought up the very earliest documents accessioned by PRONI. So D1, the original D1, is a map of lands in Cookstown from 1726. That concerns the Stewarts of Killymoon estate at Cookstown. In fact, the first three items are all relating to the Stewart estate at Cookstown. But if you jump down, D5 and D6 are rent rolls for the Ward estate at Bangor from 1746 and 1747. And if you were to continue through the D numbers, you would find many more collections of records relating to farms, farming families, and landed estates. The same goes for the T numbers as well. T numbers are transcripts of original documents, transcripts, photocopies, or even typescript copies of original documents. And they too include many items relating to the occupation of land and farming families. Okay, so I've mentioned the importance of estate papers. how the management of these great landed estates can provide excellent entry points into finding out more about the occupiers of land, those who actually farmed the land. Well, what can you find of an estate collection? Well, you get leases, lease books, rentals, surveys, maps, correspondence, and manor court records. Well, let me look at some of these in turn, just to show you some examples of these types of documents. Well, a lease is essentially a contract between, on the one hand, the landlord, and on the other, the tenant farmer. And bearing in mind that really the landed estate system in Ireland was continued in force really to a large extent until the early 20th century. In many instances, even into the 1920s, it continued to be a major factor in some localities. Well, here is an example of the lease that was granted to my great-great-great-grandfather, Robert Roulston, in 1835. Now, I should say that there is a copy of this lease in PRONI, in the Abercorn Estate Collection. This happens to be our copy of the lease, because when a lease was issued, a copy was retained by the estate, a copy was retained by the farmer, and this happens to be, we still happen to have the original lease for our farm from 1835. So the lease sets out the terms of the lease, it sets out the rent, and it includes the signatures of the landlord, in this case the Marquis of Abercorn, and also of Robert Roulston, my forebear. So what can you find in a lease? Well, I've said you get the names of the lessor and the lessee, in other words, the landlord and the farmer. You get the townland or location of the farm, and that can be very precise in some instances. It may tell you the farm was bounded on the north by so-and-so's farm, or bounded on the south by a stream called such and such. Sometimes there may be attached to the lease a map showing you more precisely where exactly the farm is located within the townland. It'll give the rent to be paid, the conditions be fulfilled by the lessee. And those conditions could be a requirement to divide the farm up into fields, to plant hedges to distinguish between those fields. It could be a requirement to build a farmhouse of certain dimensions, of certain roof structure, of certain type of walling. There may be a requirement to plant an orchard, and it may even get down to the number of trees and the type of fruit trees to be planted in that orchard. There will generally be a requirement for the tenant to take his corn to the landlord's mill, to the manor mill, and there have it ground. So the farmer was not at liberty to take his corn to wherever he wished to take it. He had to take it to the appointed mill. And then the lease will include the tenure. That is the period of time for which the lease would be valid. Now, there were generally two types of tenure. There was a lease for years. So in other words, the lease would say this lease is for duration of, say, 21 or 31 years. They were typical periods of time to be found in a lease. You could have longer leases. You could lease for 99 years or 999 years for that matter. But 21 and 31 years were fairly typical for tenant farmers. So you could have a lease for years, or you could have a lease for lives. And a lease for lives would not expire until individuals named in that lease had died. So as long as those individuals were named, or were alive, the lease was still valid. Now, typically, in the 18th century, certainly, the lives in the lease were very often the tenant farmer himself and maybe two of his children. They were the three lives in a lease. And very usefully, you may get the names, you'll get the names of those children, and you'll usually get the ages of those children as well. So when you're going back to the 18th century and maybe you're struggling to find church records, maybe there'll be no headstone to the family, just an absence of other materials relating to that family. Maybe within a lease for lives, you can find the information you're looking for. So keep an eye out, search to see if you can find a lease to your ancestors from the landlord. And if it's a lease for lives, and the lives include family members, you may be able to make a real breakthrough in your research. Now, sometimes you'll find a lease book, and a lease book is a volume that contains a summary of the leases for a particular property, for a particular estate. So rather than having to search through lots of leases, perhaps you'll get a volume out and you'll be able to flick through that until you come to the right page, and there may be a summary of the lease for your ancestors. Now, again, lease books will take account of changes in occupancy and maybe changes in the status of the persons named as lives, because of course, from the landlord's perspective, he needed to know what the status of these lives was. Were they alive or were they dead? Was the lease valid or had it expired? So a lease book will contain this sort of information. So here's a lease for a property in Caledon. It's for the Caledon estate in County Tyrone and extending over into County Armagh. The original lease is from 1751. It's for a number of lives. And then there's a note in the margin. You can see where I've expanded that to indicate that one of the lives, it said John Brown was transported as a felon to America in 1772. Now, anyone who's carried out research and looking for records of immigration from this period know that records indicating when somebody left Ireland are extremely hard to come by. And yet here we have, through a lease book, a record that John Brown was transported as a felon across the Atlantic in 1772. Now, rentals in their simplest form will provide a record of the tenants' names, the lands that they occupied, and the rent that was paid. So here's one for the Vintners estate at Malachi. The Vintners Company was one of the great London merchant companies that received lands as part of the Londonderry plantation in the early 17th century. This rental is from 1718, and you can see the first column, denomination, as in the lands. Then we have the tenants' names, and then we have the rent that the tenants, or some cases more than one tenant, joining together, paid for their farm. On the other hand, sometimes you'll find estate rentals that go into much more detail. Sometimes you'll find estate rentals that will include the date the lease was issued, the nature of the lease. If it was a lease for lives, it may well indicate the lives in the lease, and there maybe will then be a column for observations indicating the status of those lives. So looking at this one, this is for the Langford estate in County Antrim. This is sort of the area of, well, roughly speaking, say, Gage parish in County Antrim. And I've expanded a bit of text in the final observations column to say Hugh Brown. Hugh Brown had been named as one of the lives in a lease. And it says, a letter from said Brown to John, and it looks like it's been amended, but it looks a bit like Rob, dated the 20th of September, 1775 at Philadelphia. So in other words, Hugh Brown had been named as one of the lives in a lease. He had emigrated to America. Of course, the landlord needed to find out, well, is Hugh Brown alive or dead? Because, you know, is this lease still valid or not? Well, here's a bit of evidence. A letter from Hugh Brown dated at Philadelphia, 1775, proves that he must be still alive, and therefore the lease is still valid. Okay, now looking at landed estates, I'm going to look at some other rentals now, but just they'll be concerning the Abercorn estate, which was a vast estate. I mean, the Abercorn estate was one of the estates created as a result of the plantation of Ulster in the early 17th century. And over the course of the 17th century, the estate coalesced into a really vast territory, extending at its height to some 70,000 acres in the Foyle Valley. So about 50,000 acres in County Tyrone and coming up in 20,000 acres in County Donegal. And in this case, the estate was so large, it had to be broken down. It was really not one single compact manor, but a number of separate manors from McGavlin and Smockery and Donegal, then coming into Tyrone and Donalon, or my own ancestors' farm, Clogher, Strabane, and down to Derry Woon, where Barnescourt itself is located. Managing an estate like that took a lot of effort. It took numerous, at different times, agents to actually control the management of the estate. In the 18th century, the Abercorns were mainly absentee, so they relied very strongly on their agents. And there are some absolutely wonderful letters back and forth between the agents and the Earl of Abercorn about the estate. And that correspondence, which is among the best 18th century estate correspondence of any estate in Britain and Ireland for that time, has been transcribed to a very large extent and can be read on the PRONI website through the e-catalogue. And much of the transcription work was actually carried out by Dr. Brian Traynor, the then head of PRONI, while he was recuperating from a traffic accident sustained in Spain. And it's an absolutely amazing collection of records. For anybody who's looking for an ancestor from this area, there's some absolutely wonderful material in this collection. Now, looking at some of the rent books for that estate, well, they are, you can see from this slide, they're substantial volumes. They're not like a sheet of paper or some script on either side. These are substantial, bulky volumes that go into considerable detail about the tenants, about their rent payments, and about some of the issues that they faced. So just take Derry Woon. Well, Derry Woon is the area around Barnescourt itself. And looking at the rental, 1794 to 1809. And you can see there, you've got the name of the townland. You've got the name of the tenants. You've got information about the rent that was paid. There's a note there about a cost of an ejectment and so on. And a bit further down, there's actually about a payment concerning a passage from America, £13, 13 shillings. So the estate was, in other words, able to loan money to help pay for passage. Sometimes you'll find the passage even to America, sometimes the passage, which is interesting in this case, from America. And here's a loose sheet within that same rental. This is a sort of piece of paper that could easily have been discarded, thrown away, of being of no relevance, but it's titled List of Poor People in Derry Woon, and they're listed by townland. At different times, there were severe periods of dearth and famine and subsistence crises. These were maybe individuals who needed some support from the estate. Well, here's a list of the names. Now, it's not dated, but we can presume that it dates from the period covered by the rental, and more than likely by the period covered by the rental. So these are people who maybe were not even necessarily farmers. They were maybe the cottiers or labourers who worked for the farmers. But here we have lists of names. Again, something that could easily have been discarded but survives within the rent book. The other unusual items found within rent books include, in this instance, from the Gage estate, which is in the parish of McGilligan in North Derry, a list of the constables for the parish, those who were appointed to serve as constables. So the first name is John Moore of Ballymaholland, served constable in the year 1724. Then we have Samuel Gregg was chosen next. He went to New England, and John Clark Sr. served in his place for the year 1726. Now we know that at this time, from say the North Ulster especially, significant numbers of people were heading out to New England, settling in, well, many of them settling in Londonderry, New Hampshire, or in Maine, for instance, or even parts of Massachusetts. Well, here we have a record of somebody who went to New England about 1726. And if, in fact, if you go through the rent book, you'll find where there's a Samuel Gregg in a particular townland, and he's paying his rent in 1718 and 1719 and so on. And then he disappears from the rent book in 1726. So I'm almost certain that is the individual mentioned here who was parish constable. Now you can also find within estate collections some wonderful maps. The early maps are in some cases real works of art. You can see with the map maker, the cartographer was really showing off his skill in producing beautifully vibrant, colorful, richly detailed maps. You can see this is for the Moira estate, the Earl of Moira's estates in the Balnahinch area from 1782. And so you can see where using color, he is distinguished between the different farms. He names the farmer on the individual block of land. He marks in areas of bog, which was not waste ground. Bog was a very important source of fuel. You can see the road network as well marked in. For anybody looking for ancestors from this area, from the late 18th century, this is a must-see document. So maps can be especially when we go back before the 19th century, before the valuation maps, especially the Griffiths valuation maps that allow you to pinpoint locations of property. Estate maps can be fantastic sources of trying to actually pinpoint exactly where an ancestor lived, right down to farm level. And then you can also find, in some instances, manor court records. Now, the manor court was a forum for the administration of justice on land estates. Under the terms of their patents granted in the 17th century, the new estates created as a result of the Ulster plantation were given manorial status. And that meant that the landlord could summon the manor court. The court itself was presided over by an official called the seneschal, and it dealt with various issues. It dealt with, for example, disputes between tenants. Disputes, for example, one tenant owes another tenant money. How is it resolved? Through the manor court. Two tenants disagree over exactly where the boundary between their farms lies. Well, it's settled by the manor court. So when manor court records exist, they can actually be exceptionally useful to you in really providing a bit of color and vibrancy to the lives of our ancestors. So keep an eye out for these records. Also, the manor court system, incidentally, was abolished in the late 1850s, by which it should be said that many manor courts had ceased to function effectively anyway. There are other things you could find within this land estate papers. I mean, you could find so many different things within landed estates. We maybe just don't appreciate the extent to which landed estates shaped local life across Ireland, not simply in Ulster, but across Ireland for centuries, and how so much of the lives of the individuals on that estate were shaped by the estate itself and how it was managed. Something else that I came across through a landed estate collection, this is in the Lowry of Pomeroy estate collection in PRONI. Excuse me. And this is the will of a farmer on the estate. Now, you'll be aware of the loss of original wills and the catastrophic destruction of the Public Record Office in Dublin in 1922. Well, here we have a copy of an original will of a tenant farmer, and it's within an estate collection. Now, I don't need to tell you how important a discovery like this is, but it just shows that, all sorts of things can be found within landed estate collections. So don't even dismiss them if your ancestors were not necessarily farmers. You may still find information about ancestors who were labourers, cottiers through landed estate collections. Harder to find, I'll grant you that, but you never know. You may come across something that helps you understand more about them. Okay, now, just looking at the PRONI website and what can you find through it in terms of estate paper. So first of all, for many of the larger estate collections in PRONI, there is a detailed introduction. Many of those introductions were written by Dr. Anthony Malcolmson, who I mentioned already as being, a former head of PRONI and a man who made a huge contribution to preserving and salvaging land estate collections. So check out, if you even just Google significant privately deposited archives or introductions to significantly private deposited archives, you can find the right PRONI page, and you can download as a PDF that introduction. Now, the introduction itself may run to, could be 20, 30 or more pages. And the introduction will, generally speaking, provide a background to the creation of the estate, something on the vicissitudes of the landed family, and then maybe an indication of the scope of the collection, breaking it down into different categories. So again, just referring back to the Abercorn estate that was central to my own ancestors' existence for generations. Well, it's a vast collection. You can see there, it summarizes as 29,300 individually numbered documents. Okay, 29,300 individually numbered documents. 759 volumes, 88 bundles, and 40 boxes. And the covers a period 1219 to 1963. In fact, the Abercorn collection in PRONI has the oldest document in PRONI, a papal bull of 1219 that concerns an abbey in Scotland as it happens. But it shows you just how much material can be found in some of these landed estate collections. So check out the PRONI introductions to these collections. It'll give you an idea just of the background to this, and the scope of the collection. And then returning to the PRONI e-catalogue that I've mentioned already. Now, as mentioned, one of the great strengths of PRONI is the detail with which its collections have been catalogued. And you see that, for instance, in terms of the Donegal estate. The Donegal estate was founded by Sir Arthur Chichester already, and his heirs became Earls of Donegal, Donegal with 2 L's. They had a vast estate focused on South Antrim, including Belfast and Carrickfergus. They also owned virtually the entirety of the Inishowen Peninsula in County Donegal. They owned large swathes of 6 Mile Water Valley and so on. So there we have one of the Donegal estate collections in PRONI, D509. And you can see there are over 3,100 individually numbered items in that collection. Now, on the other hand, you may find collections where you still have to maybe order out a box of documents and just work your way through those documents. Or in other instances, documents leases may be organized by townland. So the Downshire estate, a vast estate in County Down, primarily in County Down, but elsewhere in Ireland as well. Well, there, the estate leases have been catalogued under the townland to which they refer. So if you know the townland in which your ancestor lived, look up the catalogue, identify that townland, and the leases will be brought out in a bundle for you to have a look at. And then you simply have to work your way through them and hopefully find your ancestor. Now, the landed estates system really came to an end in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the passing of a series of land acts that facilitated the transfer of land from landlord to farmer. And so we see the creation of a proprietorial class of farmers. Now farmers were no longer paying rent to a landlord for their farms. They actually owned them outright. I'll not say very much about the land registry archive in PRONI because it's truly vast, but it concerns the breakup of the landed estates. Now, Dr. Desmond Cave, member of staff at PRONI, has given a talk about this. And you can, if you go to the PRONI YouTube channel, you can listen to Des talk about the land registry archive in PRONI. It's in, you can see there's, the slide shows the contents of one of the land registry boxes in PRONI. So all sorts of documents, maps and schedules and inspectors' reports and title deeds and sometimes wills and so on, all brought together to provide might say, well, first of all, evidence of title. Did the individual trying to sell his estate really have the right to do that? And then also information about the farmers who are buying out their farms from the landlord. So it's a vast collection of material, vast, and it's accessible to anyone in PRONI. There are no restrictions on accessing this material. And I'll just mention in this regard as well, Ministry of Finance files. There's PRONI has a huge collection of records relating to the whole, you might say, breakup of estates, the work of the Irish Land Commission, established in 1881, which facilitated the break of estates, but also had the powers to set rents when there was a dispute between landlord and tenant about the rent. That it could adjudicate fair rents. There were other records relating to evicted tenants and the claims of evicted tenants to be restored to their farms. So there's just an example from a file for an ejected tenant in County Tyrone. And so it includes a letter from the tenant in which he sets out the circumstances and begs the estate commissioners to actually restore him to his farm, which in this case did actually happen. He was restored to his farm. So those sorts of things are found within the Ministry of Finance files within PRONI. So as I said, PRONI's cataloguing is very good. So just check out the e-catalogue. Try the surname, try the townland in your ancestor. Bearing in mind, of course, the townland spellings vary considerably, but just check these things out and you never know what you will find. Okay, valuation records. Now, I'm not going to say very much about that because you'll be familiar with the importance of the valuation of Ireland, commenced in the 1820s with the idea of valuing, ultimately, valuing every acre across Ireland. Now, the first valuation field books in PRONI date from the 1830s, and they're primarily concerned with land quality and use. However, when the work began, the evaluators were instructed to record houses worth at least £3 a year. And so they did that. It was later, within a number of years, they realized that was going to be impossible to do that. So they raised the threshold to £5 a year. But by the time most of Ulster, or most of Northern Ireland, and indeed most of Ulster for that matter, had been valued, it had been done using the £3 threshold for dwellings. And so within the first valuation field books, you can find the names of occupiers of houses valued at £3 or more. In fact, sometimes what you'll find is that the house maybe was given a notional £3 initially, and then it's revised down, so it might only have been £2, 6 shillings, and so on. But still, by the time it had been revised below £3, it had already been recorded. So there's the page for Donaghadee Parish for Gorta Bay, my ancestor, the man who received the lease, Robert Roulston, and it gives you the dimensions of his house. So we actually know how long his house was, how broad his house was, and how high the house was to the eaves. Now, there's also a code that accompanies the valuation of the buildings, and his house was given the code 2C+, which meant that it was old but in repair. It was thatched. It was built with stone or brick. It was built with stone and using lime mortar. So it's amazing the detail you'll find in the first valuation if you do happen to come across a farming ancestor whose house was recorded. Okay, now Griffith's valuation is one of the best known of genealogical sources, so I'm not going to say anything more about that now. It was for northern counties. It was published around about 1860, the years immediately either side of 1860, and was the first truly comprehensive survey of property across Ireland, from the grandest mansion to the humblest cottage. Now, what PRONI has are the field books, the original field books that were used as the basis of Griffith's valuation. It has those for Northern Ireland. And so they're not maybe very often used for genealogical purposes, but I would encourage you, if you find an ancestor in Griffiths, don't discount the possibility that you may find additional information of interest in the field books that were drawn up just a few years before the printed version of Griffiths was produced, because sometimes they will contain information that maybe didn't make it into the printed version of Griffiths. And sometimes they may even record occupiers of property who for whatever reason, either died or emigrated in the period between the field book was produced and the printed version of Griffiths was issued. So here's one for a property in the parish of Clogher in the townland of Kilmaheary. And I've just blown up the text. It says, rent low as tenant got hurt in Mr. Jervis's employment. Rent low as tenant got hurt in Mr. Jervis's employment. Mr. Jervis was the landlord, Francis J. Gervais, or Gervais, maybe is the proper pronunciation. But anyway, that's the sort of information that will not make it into the printed version of Griffiths. So keep it in mind. Keep in mind that searching through the field books prepared in the 1850s prior to Griffiths valuation, the printed version of Griffiths being issued, may contain information of use to you. And in the valuation revision books, these were produced in the aftermath of the printed version of Griffiths being issued. The first set of valuation revision books runs from the early 1860s up to about 1930. And one of the most marvelous resources on the PRONI website is the database of valuation revision books. Now, you can't search them by the name of your ancestor. You search them by place name, by townland. So if you know the townland, search for the townland and go through them. And the purpose of valuation revision books was to keep updating changes in occupancy of the names recorded in, or the properties rather, recorded in Griffiths valuation. So for example, an occupier, dies or emigrates, or maybe builds a new house for that matter, those changes will be noted in the valuation revision books. So here is one for the townland of Gordevay, where my own ancestors lived, and you can see where it's obviously a manuscript volume. It gives the townland across, the electoral division across the top, then the townland, names of the occupiers. If you notice, there is a stamp with the letters LAP within it. Well, that indicates that the farm had been bought out under the terms of one of the land acts. So that can be a useful way of finding out when your ancestor actually bought out his farm, her farm. When did they actually become, at least the date by which they had become proprietor of it. And you'll see also the way there are various annotations. Sometimes different colored writing was used to distinguish between years and so on. And if you go down, you'll see a property in the possession of Thomas Roulston, who was my great-great-grandfather. And there's a bit of script over in the column on the right-hand side. And if I've loaded up a bit bigger, well, first of all, at the top, you'll see where it says Thomas Roulston, his name crossed out, and Charles written in, Charles, my great-grandfather. Then down below, excuse me, you can see where it, a bit of writing, it says actually, Charles has gone to Australia. Charles has gone to Australia. Now, he obviously came back, otherwise I would not be giving this talk now. But, that was maybe information that was would be hard to come across. You maybe wouldn't even think to look for an ancestor who'd gone to Australia and then returned. But there's something that's turned up through the valuation revision books. And again, I emphasize, this is not typical or common. You'll find information like this, but at the same time, you can't discount the possibility that you may well come across material of this importance. So valuation revision books, a fantastic resource available through the PRONI website. Okay, just mentioned wills, of course, another fantastic resource available through the PRONI website, a catalogue of wills. These include the will calendars that post-date the Probate Act of 1857. So these date from 1858 onwards, when the state assumed responsibility for testamentary affairs. And of course, many farmers left wills. And in those wills, you can find all sorts of information about how the property was to be divided up between the family members. I mean, maybe the farm went to the eldest son, for example, but there may be provision for younger sons or for the farmer's widow, for instance, how was she to be looked after during her widowhood. So all sorts of things can be found in wills. So the PRONI will calendars include the summaries of wills found in those calendars from 1858 up until the 1960s. And then up until about 1900, or even going slightly beyond 1900, you will find that you can actually access digital scans of the wills. These are scans made of the will books kept by the district registries. The original will books are in PRONI. Well, as part of this marvelous digitization project, the will books were scanned. They were linked to the wills listed in the will calendars. And so you can go from the database, find the will and the will calendar, and then if you click image, you can actually see the copy, the transcript of the will from the will book. So again, fantastic resource for anybody looking not simply for farming ancestors, but any ancestors. But certainly you'll find much about farming ancestors through this. Okay, to run through a number of other sources. Another database you can find on the PRONI website are the registers of freeholders. In fact, I think this is possibly the oldest database on the PRONI website. This was created back in the early 2000s. Records of registers of freeholders. Freeholders were those entitled to vote, and what qualified one to vote in the 18th and early 19th centuries was the possession of a lease for lives, or for at least one life. Okay, I've mentioned leases for lives already in the context of landed estates. Well, a farmer in possession of a lease for lives above a certain value was able to vote in parliamentary elections. That was the nature of the franchise. You could have a large farm for a term of years, maybe you could have 100 acres for 100 years. You couldn't vote. You could have a small farm of, say, 15 acres for a life, and you could vote. That was simply the way the franchise worked. So PRONI has a large collection of freeholders registered. Now, they are, I should say, a bit hit and miss in terms of their coverage for Ulster counties. They're very good for counties Armagh and Down, not very good at all for County Tyrone, unfortunately, or even County Londonderry is also not very good either. But just to show you an example, so here is one of these freeholders registers. Is actually called the Deputy Court Checkbook for County Antrim 1776. You'll see the information is presented in tabular format. So you've got the name of the freeholder, the location of the freeholder, or freehold, the residence of the freeholder, which may or may not be the same. It usually is, but sometimes the freeholder lived at a different place from where this freeholder was located. And then you've got an observations column. So I'll just pick out one example. This is for William Tate, whose freehold was in Murusk. And down below, there's a comment, comes to vote under his father John Tate's registry. Okay, says his mother's name was Lennox, that the lease was made to his father about 30 years ago, that he is dead from 10 to 16 years, that he had no brothers or sisters living. Then it says, objected to for bribery for want of freehold. Now, it may well be that he had made that statement entirely up, but at the same time, maybe there's a kernel of truth in it. Maybe it's all true, and he was simply guilty of bribery. But think of the information recorded in that, and how hard it would be to find that degree of information from other sources from as far back as 1776. So freeholders registers, check them out. You never know, you may find information about your farming families. I should point out, of course, that for most of the 18th century, the franchise was restricted to Protestants. Now, Presbyterians could vote as well as Anglicans, but Catholics could not vote. The franchise was restored to Catholics in 1793. In 1803, an agricultural census was carried out in various parishes in Ireland. There are returns in the National Archives in Dublin of the census conducted in North Antrim in 1803. PRONI has the returns for the agricultural census conducted in County Down. They're actually found within the estate papers of the Marquess of Londonderry. it was drawn up in response to concerns of a French invasion of Ireland. This is during the Napoleonic Wars. For County Down includes quite a number of parishes, not simply coastal parishes, but in some instances, the parishes concerned were a fair distance inland. So you can see here an example of a page for the parish of Drumgooland. It's you might say it's a pro forma sheet, which is then filled in. You get the name of the farmer, the livestock, and the dead stock. The dead stock being crops. And you can see the livestock is divided into oxen and cows and young cattle, pigs, sheep, and so on. One thing that comes through from this is just how few items of livestock that farmers actually possessed. I mean, if you look through it, to have even 4 cows was quite considerable at that time. I mean, look how many people, for example, have only got 1 pig, and how few of them even have 1 sheep, as many as 1 sheep. So numbers of livestock were certainly small at this time. Records of farming societies can be found in PRONI. At different times, farmers banded together to, for different purposes, to preserve and defend their interests, or to share knowledge and encourage agricultural improvement. Well, you can find here in PRONI the records of some of these farming societies. A very good collection of farming society records are those for the Killilay, Killinchy, Kilmood, and Tullynakill Farming Society, which include records going back to 1828. Farmers themselves very often kept accounts or diaries or journals. And so PRONI has a very good collection of such records. I mean, their survival is very much linked to, you could say, the size of the farm. Generally speaking, if a farmer kept an account book, it's because he had a reasonably sized farm and so needed to have some sort of grasp of the financial situation. Excuse me. Sometimes farmers, as I said, kept diaries. So Samuel Carlyle, farmer at Knockbracken in County Down, kept a diary, and that diary is in PRONI for 1840 to 1845. And so on. So you may even find information about farm labourers and their wages through these diaries. They'll also include information about local occurrences, about maybe other local families, records of people who had married or died or emigrated. I mean, a fabulous collection of diaries of farmer are those for James Harshaw of Donaghmore in County Down. And there's a very interesting story behind that. You can actually go on to the PRONI e-catalogue, you can read something of the story behind that. It's really a very interesting account of how these diaries were created in the first place, but eventually came to be in PRONI. So check out records of farmers. And even if you can find a record, a diary or an account book of your own farming ancestor, we'll see if any other farmers in the area where they lived kept diaries or account books, and whether maybe they contain information about your ancestors. So thank you very much for listening to that talk. I hope it's been of some help to you, and I've given you at least a flavour of the range of material that can be found in PRONI. PRONI is a superb archive. It has some absolutely fabulous collections of records built up now over the better part of a century. So if you are looking for your farming ancestors, or even your ancestors who lived in the countryside, whether they farmed or not, I would certainly encourage you to consider a visit to PRONI. And for those of you looking for farming ancestors, I have written a book which is not simply about Northern Ireland. It looks at the broad range of records for researching farming ancestors across the island of Ireland. And you can purchase that, if you wish, through the website of the Ulster Historical Foundation, booksireland.org.uk. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope that has been helpful to you. Thank you.